A house vanished without a trace. No burned walls, no debris, just bare ground where it stood yesterday. And the only witness is certain they heard someone scream. I was driving down a desolate highway in Nevada when I heard the news report on the radio, disappearance of the Wilson family. Their house, gone. The radio host sounded bewildered, as if he didn't believe what he was saying. I'm Detective Michael Connor, and this story wasn't part of my plans. The summer heat pressed against my car windows as I cranked up the air conditioning. After 15 years on the job, I thought I'd seen everything the criminal world had to offer. Murder, theft, fraud, they all followed patterns, left evidence, made sense in their twisted way. But a house that simply vanished? That was new. I needed coffee and a break from the monotonous landscape. When I pulled into a gas station in Milford, a small town that seemed to exist solely to serve travelers passing through, I overheard two men discussing the very case that had caught my attention on the radio. I was there that night, mumbled an old man in a dust-covered hat. His face was weathered like the surrounding landscape, deep lines etched by sun and time. Saw the light. Red, pulsating. Then a scream. And in the morning, nothing. The house just disappeared. His companion, a younger man in a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned by outdoor work, looked skeptical. Houses don't just vanish, Dale. There must have been some explanation. A sinkhole, maybe. Sinkholes don't make that kind of light, the old man insisted, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. And they don't make sounds like that. I approached them, coffee in hand. Where exactly was this? The old man, Dale, eyed me suspiciously, his gaze lingering on my city clothes and the slight bulge of my holster beneath my jacket. When I showed him my detective badge, his demeanor shifted slightly, though wariness remained in his eyes. 4 miles west, he finally muttered. Road through the hills. Can't miss it. Just a big empty patch now where the Wilsons' house used to be. You know the Wilsons? I asked. Not well. Kept to themselves mostly. Moved in about 2 years ago. Quiet folk. He worked from home, something with computers. She taught piano to kids from town. Had a teenager too, I think. I thanked him and returned to my car. I hadn't planned on working during this trip, I was technically on vacation, driving to my brother's place in Utah, but something about the story had hooked me. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe just the break in monotony. Either way, I found myself turning west at the next junction, following a narrow road that wound through low, rocky hills. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across the landscape as I drove. The road wasn't well maintained, and my sedan bounced over potholes and cracks in the asphalt. After about 10 minutes, I spotted it, a rectangular patch of bare earth amid the scrubby desert vegetation. It stood out like a scar on the landscape. I parked on the side of the road and approached the site slowly. The empty plot was eerily perfect, a precise rectangle of barren soil about 40 by 60 feet. Not just the house, but the foundation too, had been completely removed. Even the surrounding gravel driveway had vanished, leaving only undisturbed desert soil. This wasn't a demolition job. I'd seen plenty of those, and they always leave something behind, concrete chunks, splinters of wood, metal fixtures, or at the very least, tire tracks from heavy machinery. This was different. The area looked as if the house had been surgically extracted from reality. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I walked the perimeter. The surrounding desert scrub and cacti were completely intact, even at the very edge of the bare patch. There was no sign of construction equipment having accessed the site. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the soil. It was cool to the touch, despite the blistering heat. I scooped up a handful and let it sift through my fingers. No ash, no fragments of building material. Just ordinary desert dirt. Strange, isn't it?" The voice startled me. I turned to see a woman standing a few yards away. Mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a sensible ponytail, wearing faded jeans and a light hiking shirt with a camera hanging around her neck. She had the weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. "Sorry, didn't mean to spook you," she said, approaching with an extended hand. "Linda Reeves. I live about a mile down the road." I introduced myself, showing her my badge out of habit. "A detective, huh? Figured someone official would show up eventually." She surveyed the empty plot. "Been taking pictures since it happened. For documentation." "You saw what happened?" She shook her head. "Heard it. Woke up around 3 in the morning to what sounded like well, not exactly an explosion. More like air being sucked out of a vacuum-sealed container, but louder. Much louder. By the time I got dressed and drove over, the house was gone and the ground looked exactly like this." I pulled out my notepad. "Did you know the Wilsons? Sarah gave piano lessons to my granddaughter. Nice family. Quiet. Tom worked in cybersecurity or something, home office in their basement." Linda crossed her arms, her expression troubled. "No one's found them, have they?" "Not that I've heard." I glanced around the barren rectangle again. "Any strange occurrences before this happened? Anything unusual about the family?" Linda hesitated. "Nothing about the family, no. But..." She looked down at the ground, then back at me with uncertainty in her eyes. "There was something odd about the land. Even before the Wilsons built here." "What do you mean?" I prompted when she didn't continue. Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Native folks from around here, the older ones, they wouldn't come near this spot. My late husband was friendly with a Paiute elder who once told him this place had bad medicine. Said it was a thin spot. Whatever that means. I'd heard similar stories before. Every town has its local superstitions and haunted locations. Usually, there's a rational explanation behind the legends. But standing on that perfectly empty rectangle of land, I couldn't dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. "I'd like to check the local records," I said. "Is there a county office or library nearby?" Linda nodded. "Town Hall in Milford has property records. The library there might have some historical information too." I thanked her and got her contact information before heading back to my car. The wind had picked up, sending small dust devils spinning across the barren patch where the house had stood. For just a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, but when I paused to listen, there was only the sound of sand shifting against rock. The Milford Town Hall was a squat, brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Inside, a bored-looking clerk directed me to the property records office in the basement. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I followed musty-smelling stairs down to a room filled with filing cabinets and a single ancient computer terminal. The clerk there, an elderly woman named Martha with cat-eye glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, seemed delighted to have company. "The Wilson property?" "Oh yes, terrible business." She clucked her tongue while pulling out several folders. "Such a lovely family. Their daughter was in my granddaughter's class." I flipped through the property records. The Wilsons had purchased the land 2 years ago and built their house shortly after. The previous owner was a developer who'd bought it from the county after it had sat vacant for decades. "Has anything unusual ever happened on that property before?" I asked. Martha's expression changed subtly. "Well, now that you mention it." She turned to a filing cabinet behind her and extracted a much older folder, its edges frayed with age. "This isn't exactly public information, but since you're with the police." She spread out a collection of documents dating back to the 1950s. There was another house there, built in 1954 by a man named Howard Schaefer. Scientist of some kind who worked at a government facility nearby. Very secretive. I scanned the papers. The house had been similar in size to the Wilsons, a ranch style with a partial basement. What happened to it? I asked. Martha leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. That's the strange part. In 1972, there was an incident. The official report says there was a gas explosion that destroyed the house. But. She hesitated. But. I prompted. My husband was deputy sheriff back then. He told me there wasn't any debris. Just a clean, empty piece of land where the house had been. No foundation, no wreckage, nothing. Just like now. She pushed her glasses up her nose. And 6 people went missing: Schaefer, his wife, their 2 children, and a couple who was visiting them. Never found a trace of any of them. A chill ran through me despite the stuffy basement air. Were there any witnesses? Martha nodded slowly. A neighbor reported seeing strange lights and hearing an unusual sound. Not an explosion, something else. Described it as a kind of humming that got higher and higher until it was almost unbearable, then silence. She looked at me meaningfully. Sound familiar? It did. Uncomfortably so. There's more, Martha said, sliding across a brittle newspaper clipping from 1922. I found this when researching local history for our centennial celebration. The yellowed clipping showed a photograph of the same plot of land, but with a different house, a 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance Baffles Authorities." According to the article, the family living there, the Cartwrights, had vanished overnight, along with their entire home. Neighbors reported strange lights and sounds. The land was left perfectly bare. 3 times in a century, I murmured, examining the photograph closely. Same location, same phenomenon. Martha nodded gravely. And each time, separated by exactly 50 years. I looked up sharply. 50 years. 1922, 1972, and now 2022. She tapped the dates on the document spread before us. Whatever it is, it seems to run on a schedule. I spent the next hour copying everything I could find about the previous incidents. The 1972 case had been investigated by both local police and federal agents, though the FBI files were apparently classified. The 1922 disappearance had been largely written off as an elaborate insurance fraud, though no evidence was ever found to support that theory. By the time I left town hall, the sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. I decided to visit the only neighbor close enough to have witnessed anything the night the Wilsons disappeared. Jack Thornton lived in a modest ranch house about half a mile down the road from the Wilson property. When I pulled up, he was sitting on his front porch, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the lean, weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. Dark circles underlined his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept well recently. He eyed my car warily as I parked, but relaxed slightly when I showed him my badge. Another detective? Already talked to the sheriff's department and some guys from the state police. I'm actually just passing through, I admitted, climbing the porch steps. Heard about what happened and got curious. Jack gestured to an empty chair. Professional curiosity, huh? Well, take a seat. Not like I'm sleeping much anyway. I sat down, noting how his gaze kept drifting toward the direction of the Wilson property, visible as a distant patch through the scrubby trees. You saw something that night? He took a long drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the gathering dusk. Heard it first. A scream. He shuddered visibly. Not like anything I've ever heard before. Not quite human, but definitely a scream of terror. What time was this? About 3 in the morning. I'm a light sleeper, military training never quite leaves you. The scream woke me up. Then I saw the light, red, pulsing, coming through my window. Jack stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. I grabbed my flashlight and ran over there. Thought maybe there was a fire, that they needed help. But by the time I got there, maybe 5 minutes later, there was nothing. No house. No fire. No Wilsons. Just bare earth, like you see now. His hand trembled as he lifted the cigarette to his lips. Like someone just erased them from existence. Did you notice anything else? Anything unusual in the days leading up to that night? Jack hesitated, his eyes darting around as if checking whether anyone else might be listening. Tom, Mr. Wilson, he'd been acting strange the last few weeks. Jumpy. Installing security cameras all around the property. Asked me to keep an eye out for unusual vehicles in the area. Did he say why? No, but... Jack lowered his voice. About a week before it happened, I was bringing over a package that got delivered to my place by mistake. Heard him arguing with someone on the phone in his office. Something about frequencies and temporal anomalies. He was saying they needed to leave, that it wasn't safe. That caught my attention. Temporal anomalies. You're sure that's what he said? Jack nodded. I was in Afghanistan, worked signals intelligence for a while. You pick up scientific terms. It stuck out because it sounded like something from a sci-fi movie, not real life. I made a note of it. Did Wilson ever mention his work to you? What exactly he did? Something in cybersecurity, that's all I knew. But there were people who came to visit sometimes. Government types, you can always tell. Suits and serious faces, driving black SUVs with government plates. As the darkness deepened around us, Jack grew more agitated. You know what the weirdest thing is? My security camera caught something that night. I've got one that points toward their property, installed it after my shed got broken into last year. My pulse quickened. You have footage? Had, he corrected, bitterness edging his voice. When those government agents came by, they took the SD card. Said it was evidence. He leaned forward. But I'd already watched it. And I made a copy. Jack led me inside his house, a modestly furnished space that spoke of a solitary life. He booted up an old desktop computer and inserted a thumb drive. Most of it's just darkness, he explained as a video player opened. But watch. The timestamp showed 3:14 a.m. At first, there was only darkness, then a faint red glow began to illuminate the distant Wilson house. The quality was poor, but I could make out the building's silhouette. There, Jack pointed as the glow intensified. Something was happening to the house. It seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Then the red light pulsed brighter, and for a split second, the house looked transparent. I could see straight through it to the stars beyond. Another pulse, and where the house had been, there was a strange distortion in the air, like reality itself was bending. Then came the flash, so bright it momentarily whited out the camera. When the image cleared, the house was gone. Just empty land. I've never shown this to anyone else, Jack said quietly. They'd think I was crazy. I watched the video 3 more times, focusing on different details each time. Something about the way the house had disappeared reminded me of special effects I'd seen in movies, but more organic. As if the fabric of reality had folded around the structure. Can I have a copy of this? I asked. Jack hesitated, then nodded. Just, be careful who you show it to. After collecting the file and thanking Jack, I drove back to the empty plot. Night had fallen completely now, and the Nevada desert was eerily silent except for the occasional distant call of a coyote. I parked at the edge of the road and sat in my car, staring at the bare patch of earth illuminated by my headlights. 50-year cycles. Government interest. A cybersecurity expert installing cameras and talking about temporal anomalies before vanishing along with his entire house. None of it added up to anything rational, and yet I decided to do something that probably violated several departmental protocols. I was going to spend the night at the site. Armed with a flashlight, my service weapon, a camera, and a digital recorder, I set up a makeshift observation post at the edge of the empty plot. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the day's heat. Stars blazed overhead in the clear desert sky, so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. Hours passed uneventfully. I recorded regular observations into my digital recorder, more to stay awake than out of any real hope of capturing evidence. By 3 a.m., my eyes were heavy, and I was beginning to question my judgment in this impromptu stakeout. Then, at precisely 3:12 a.m., something changed.